I am curious about what were some of the ideas that you were given growing up about what a successful career would look like, right? What were some of the cliches that you heard about professional success, and how did those play out in your life? Was it very similar to what you thought it would be? What were the realizations you had as you went along?
Yeah. So, for instance, I was born into a typical Kerala family. Education was at a premium, and my parents worked really, really hard to give three of us a good education. I have two brothers, one older and one younger. And for 20 years of their life, they lived in different parts of the world, making sure that three of us had a stable life, and we went to the best schools and colleges possible, and we had everything that we needed to pursue our dreams of a better life. And it was really, it was not a house where um, it's not one of these modern age conversations that were happening in the house in terms of, in a way, to start a business, you can do what you want. No, it was very steady and straightforward, which is that, you want a better life than what you have now. You have to put yourself through good schools, good colleges, do well at your education, and for that we would do everything that we need to do to support three of you to achieve it. So that was what my parents agenda, right? And they did that. The other thing also is I was born into, although I had two brothers, other than for very very few things like mobility fights, negotiations on mobility, not being able to go out after dark in the evenings. I've pretty much grown up not experiencing my growing up as being very markedly different from that of my brothers. I've had almost the same similar freedoms. I was the first child to leave home to study, go outside the state and study. And I remember at that time it was a big thing in my extended family and the circle of family friends. They were like, you're sending a girl out to study. But my parents are also the kinds of people who have always let us make our choices. I mean, there are negotiations and discussions and all of that, and there is no, often not, it's not like there is immediate agreement, but at the end of it, they will allow us, they will honor the decisions that we make, right? And so I went out to study, and so I pretty much grew up getting the same support that my brothers got, right? And so what it did to me is, and I did very well while I was in school. I was a good student, top of the class, and overall, you're doing well. I mean, you're a school prefect, you're a house prefect, you're doing well in sports. So it's like a high performance kind of a trajectory, right? When you're in school, and so when that happens, you feel you're on track, right? And I was also brought up by a woman who always told me that standing on my own two feet was important, right? We're like, for us at home, there were a few compulsory things to do. Among one of them was watching the Doordarshan news, right, in the early 90s. Doordarshan English news in the evenings, right? Doordarshan news in the evenings. And I remember my mother would tell me often, look at those news anchors, they're so smart, right? And they're so articulate. And Manu, you should be like that, you should be smart and you should be articulate and you should be fearless. She also told me always that, don't get married without getting a job, right? Be independent and then get married. None of these happened. I mean, in the sense, I got married while I was still at college. I didn't wait for my to get a work. But so when you're growing up, given all this, you think your plan is going to work, right? Which is not, even if it's not specific. Broadly, there is an idea of how your life is going to play out and how your professional careers are going to play out. For my brothers, it did happen pretty much like that. That plan stayed. But for me, I think one of the things that I struggled with the most was this feeling that, I all of what I had worked towards went so horribly wrong because of a personal choice that I made. And today I have come to believe, not just because of my own life, but also from observing, a lot of other women's lives, that personal choices that women make in terms of who your intimate partners are going to be has a profound impact on your career, right? Even if it is not a violent or abusive marriage. And it's a choice to be made, and often it doesn't. So the irony of it is, most of us, it doesn't happen like that. You can only control that variable to a certain extent, right? I mean, even if you plan, you can't plan too much about it. So then, for me, it was, that was really, really hard for me to come to terms with, because the choice was also mine. Yeah, it was a love marriage, and we knew each other from 1999, and we dated for quite some time before we decided to get married. And in hindsight, I today understand that none of that was okay. Was what was happening was okay. I didn't know it then. So what happened is, I started working 2007 straight out of IRMA. I started working with the Fisherwomen's Society in South India, and I worked for a year, and I had to take a break. I was married then. I had to take a break because I had to go to US to join my then husband, who was there, who had been there for quite some time by then. And I got married during my first semester break at IRMA. So I got married while still studying, which was also unplanned. And then my break was unplanned because the understanding was that he would come back after his stint, and that didn't happen, so I had to go. Unfortunately, I had a very difficult marriage, very traumatizing marriage. I was in US only for 6 months, and the 6 months was not pleasant at all, to put it mildly. There was a lot of trauma, and when I came back, I didn't come back in a good way. So even though I came back in a very short period of time, and if all was well, I could have gotten back into the workforce quite soon without too much of a break quite early in my career, I could not do that because of what had happened when I was in US, which was it was an abusive marriage. And so to recover from the way that I came back took me almost another 9 months, right? So I was bordering on the verge of, I was at my all-time low weight of 51 kilos, and I sunk into the back of nowhere, and really numb. And it took me about 9 months of 8 or 9 months of staying at home with my parents to come back to life and actually begin to even want to do something. And but I did get back, and I got back to work with a public health organization. After 9 months of being at home, I was like, I need to work. And what can you do? How do you explain a break so early in your career in a professional setting? That those were the thoughts that were going through my mind. And by then, my batchmates and my peers had moved on to their second jobs, and or already risen up in their existing jobs, and you have 1 year of experience to show. You are also not feeling very confident. The thing about surviving trauma is also that you tend to feel very, very small at the end of it, and your confidence is at an all-time low. And for someone who is, even if you've been a person who has been feeling really, really, you've grown up knowing yourself as a person with a lot of self-confidence, you have led teams when you were in school and college, or you were at the top of your class, none of that, all of that tends to go away when you go through an experience of violence, right? And so it was not something that I wanted to do, or it was not something that I looked for. I spoke to a few people. My batchmate Rajneesh was one of them, and I had no prior experience in public health. But there was a team called Knowledge Management, and they were recruiting. Rajneesh knew it, and he referred my CV. But then very soon I had to take another break because of again the tumult in my marriage, right? And so I went through another long periods of break, almost a year. Middle of 2011, my divorce came through, and then from 2011 onwards, I've been able to stay at work consistently. Except for a 6 to 8 months break at the end of 2016, and that was because of one of the main reasons for it was also that I had overworked myself so much over the past few years since I got back to work after my coming back from US, that I was completely burnt out, and and I'd also been coping with a lot of mental health issues for the past since 2000, trauma-induced mental health issues since 2010. So it had to happen at some point, I think, and none of this was really easy. And it kind of, so this whole narrative, when I hear about people planning their careers and people planning their careers based on purpose, right? The whole purpose question, it makes me feel very marginalized, if I can use that word, because it's it's also something that's when you have too much flux going in your personal life. I think going after a singular purpose and being able to do everything that's needed to follow that singular purpose is it's very hard, or almost next to impossible is what I feel. Because your primary agenda is to cope with what's happening in your personal life and stabilizing that. Point that I want to make is that careers, and what I found is women's careers rarely are linear. It is characterized by lot of tumult and lots of flux, even for someone who is in a good intimate partner relationship, and even for someone who is in a good marriage. And those are well documented, right? It's well known that women move out of career and workforce when they have, when they go through pregnancy, when they choose to have children. And that's really, really well documented and spoken about.
Priya, you've told me quite a few times about how you had to make deliberate choices in your professional life to make space for what's happening in your personal life, right? What did that look like? Would you want to talk about how that played out?
Yeah, so in 2010, once I got separated, I had to again get back into the market and start looking for work. But I did not want to do any of what I had done before, which is that, search for jobs in the open market without knowing what the organization is going to be, what the org culture is going to be. I wanted to go into a space, mostly, ideally a women's organization, a small organization where I was pretty much assured that I would find support, right? And I would find an organization where people were used to actively supporting women who had gone through a personal life crisis. And I wanted to be in a small, secure, safe space, right? And basically, so Best Practices Foundation, which I joined in 2010, was in that way a very, very deliberate choice, right? Not that particular organization, but it came at the end of my research for an organization like that. Largely a women's organization, used to, with very firm and a core belief in helping women move on with their life, supporting them do what they want, all of that. And BPF, I must tell you, I think it's one of the best choices that I could have made personally and professionally. So I did some of my best work in my career in those 2.5 years. And it's also thanks to the leadership there. The founder, Sangeeta, who's today my very dear friend. But, she was this incredible person, and she continues to be. She was a professor in the US, and she had left the professorship in the US to come back to find community in India. And she wanted to leave the individualism of the West and come back to find community in India after being in US, doing her PhD and then teaching there a few years in Columbia and then coming back, right? So she ended up creating an organizational space which valued that at the core, which is community, right? And I benefited hugely from this. Not just from her, but she and her entire family and the small team that was there in BPF at the time. I was surrounded by these fierce women, who were so invested in making sure that I got better. And today I cannot imagine, of course there are other scenarios that could have played out, but today when I look back, that was so pivotal that I made that choice, right? I mean, to deliberately look for an organization like that where I would feel supported and I could get back on my feet, and I found it, and I was lucky that I found it. It could have been any way. People are not lucky all the time. We're not lucky all the time, but I was lucky that I found it. And Sangeeta was also this person who not just believes in helping women do well, but she also believes in helping people who are starting out in their careers, and young people do give them as many opportunities as she can. She was this person who would. I remember there was this UN General Assembly presentation had to be done, and she said. She was like, you go and make the presentation. I was so startled. I mean, I was there for 1 year in that space, and I was like, what does that mean? It's such a senior level delegation meeting. It's a personal invitation. We had done a study for UNDP on, multi-country study on anti-corruption and gender. And, she was like, you go make the presentation and you speak at the UN General Assembly. And I was like, maybe not. But, for 2.5 years, all the opportunities that came to me, she just kept pushing me up to doing things that I think in most other organizations juniors will hardly ever get to do. And as long as you showed potential and you worked hard, she would actively encourage to make sure that you saw success and you could have as many ways to realize your potential. And that for me, that professionally, for me to feel validated that way was a big part of my healing, the start of my healing process, right? Because I was really harboring this feeling of what a great sense of unfairness that had happened to me. My story is nothing exceptional, right? It's a very normal story, like of many other women, and it's very well known that the impacts of violence on women are very skewed against them as opposed to men. And especially when they come out of that which happens in the context of a marriage, right? And so that way there is nothing exceptional about it, but I was still feeling what I was feeling. And for me to be able to get that opportunity, so when I got back to life and trying to rebuild my life, was very, very significant. So that was a choice that I deliberately made.
But do you think making these choices come at a cost? Because there aren't too many organizations that are the way you describe this organization to be, right? That factors in the personal life crises that people are going through, say for instance, and hold space for that to happen, unfold opportunities for them to feel more empowered. And so do you think they come at a cost? For you, did it come at a cost as well, do you think?
So there are obvious, there are trade-offs that you have to make, right? I mean, you're not going to, you're probably not going to earn too well, right? I mean, so there was not enough, the pay was low, you're also going to, so certain aspects of your life in terms of picking up, it's going to take that much more longer, right? So financial stability is going to take longer. So there are costs to it. I mean, every choice that you make, there are costs to it. But I feel, in your when you're trying to be well in your well-being journey at any point in time, you have to be able to prioritize. And is it unfortunate? Maybe in many ways it is, because if you didn't have to go through that experience, then you are able to better give weightage to a lot of factors that you cannot if you are getting out of a abusive marriage, and then you're dealing with trauma induced mental health issues, right? Because then well-being, emotional well-being and mental health well-being takes precedence over everything else, all the other things, and you have to reorient your other choices that you make, deprioritize and reorient other choices that you make based on that, right? And so I didn't earn very much, and I did have to work, I did full-time work at BPM, but I also did other consulting project, because I had a education loan that I had to repay, which was not paid, so it had gathered fine, and it was a substantial amount, and on top of it, so that was the cost that I paid for it. I mean, if we had to talk of it, so I don't think it's straightforward. I mean, it's not like you make a choice and everything about the choice is going to be all right. But the important thing is, what do you want to prioritize? And I have later realized that when you have a mental health problem, it is, for me, it's been the best to prioritize that and make decisions around it. Because even if the other factors like a better pay, better position, larger company, all of that works out, it's not really going to have a very soothing, calming effect on on your well-being.
And
right?
I don't think you would be in a position to leverage those as well, right?
Depends on what is the extent of the crisis that you are dealing with, right? I mean, so in the initial few years, I did not feel brave enough to apply for opportunities at all. Leave initial few years, I mean, till about 1.5 years ago, it's taken me 10 years. So it's taken me 10 years to come back to feeling confident, come back to feeling like, my opportunity landscape is much bigger in terms of, more, in terms of where I can move from my career, in terms of the kind of responsibilities that I can take. I feel confident about taking up in terms of, because for me, I was, it was in 2011, I must tell you, when my first anxiety diagnosis came to being. Mid of 2011, I used to live in a Barsati at that time, near my office. And, one day at night, I jumped out of my bed startled because I felt like an insect was moving from my head to toe, right? And I jump out and I'm like, patting myself down, and I'm jumping up and down thinking that there's cockroach or there is an insect and it needs to go out. And it didn't happen, but I had that feeling, that sensation, tingling sensation all through the night, and very quickly, in a few days, it developed into pain, and I became, my right hand from shoulder to it was immobilized. So I went to the hospital, all sorts of tests, specialized tests, super specialty doctors, specialized doctors, all kinds of tests, all of which came out showing that I have no physical problems, right? And so then the doctor said, okay, now you do physiotherapy as it goes. And I went to a very good hospital in town, and so 10 days of physiotherapy, some relief in terms of pain. But again, back to square one once that got over. Finally, a really smart, and I'm really grateful for her, I forget the doctor's name, she's in HOSMAT, she used to be in HOSMAT then. She said, Priya, what you have is somatization. And I was like, what is somatization? And she said, it's a stress disorder. And I was like, impossible, right? So I'm in denial. Because for me, in my head, by then, the worst of my life was over. Right? I mean, everything that was stressing me out and that was a point of agony in my life was over. And I was out of a bad marriage. I had got separated, then I got a divorce. I'd gotten into a job and I was slowly picking my life back. I was working myself crazy. But it was over, right? And so, stress disorder, no. And I was in a happy place. BPF made me very happy. And I had a very supportive co-worker ecosystem and people who truly cared, access to Sangeeta's family, who loved me deeply. So it was, And I kept denying, and finally she was like, you should be happy that you don't have multiple sclerosis, because typically these symptoms also show up on that, and that's what a lot of people in Bangalore, especially from the IT industry, young people turn up with. And if you had that, that would have been really tough. This is a stress disorder. You also have anxiety, and it can be managed. It's a manageable condition. So I quietened down, obviously. I mean, and then I go back and I share this news with my work family and then my family. And my mother, as always, a great champ, right? I mean, she was like, immediately go to the doctor. So I'm someone who takes a lot of time to make decisions. But once I make them, I stick to them. So, I mean, I took my time to think through, to make sense of what was happening, right? And why is this happening? And also to find the doctor. And I found a good doctor. I went to him, and they started me out on medication. I started on medication. The first week of medication, the first 10 days of medication, I felt like a zombie. Because it always happens, right? In psychiatric medications, it takes some time for you're lucky if the dosage gets fixed as soon as in the first, your body gets time to get used to it. And so first week I was like a zombie. And when I think back, I feel like if the space was not understanding and supportive, and if I was just transfer myself and my context and what was happening in my life to another organization, where the culture, where it was not small, where the culture was not so accommodating and understanding, where people didn't know about each other's lives so closely, right? And what their journeys were. I think what I had to deliver at work and concerns at work would have kind of already added to my existing anxiety, right? Because workspaces hardly can make space for this kind of prolonged problems, yeah. And but I didn't have to. So the beauty of BPO was that I didn't have to. I worked when I could. My others pitched in when I couldn't, and not even for a second did I feel bad about being unwell and bad about not being able to perform, and that perform ghost was in my head, but whatever that was, I didn't feel bad about it. So I could, instead I found support, right, to deal with it and to get back to work. I don't really have answers on how workplaces can create this, right? But I do have experiences over the 10 years, 13 years of my career of what can happen when workplaces create this and what can happen when they don't, when the culture is toxic, right? When the culture is toxic, even those who do not have a stress or a mental health issue will find it very hard to cope and perform, right? And so workplace culture becomes really, really important. Especially if you are trying to be space that's inclusive of mental health, people with mental health struggles, right? Because if there is something that defines it, I think in my case it's there's a lot of inconsistency and a lot of struggle, right? I mean, but what I got on medication, and then the medication I took it for 7 months. And in 7 months, I was like, this is not a physical problem. So medication can only solve so much. So what is there? So there are some deeper issues to be resolved. And because somatization is not a physical problem in that sense. And anxiety that I was feeling was not physical. So I clearly had to process what had happened with me, right? And I again spent time looking for a therapist, and I soon started my therapy. But it took me 7 months. And the thing is, my mother told me even 7 months before to start therapy, right? Sometimes I feel she's far ahead of the times, because it's, you would think people in our generation would embrace and welcome it way more than people in my mother's generation. But she was like, go and get the care you need and get the treatment you need and do what's necessary. So that also helped, right? I had a very supportive family. I have this whole concept that I'm deeply invested in, and I firmly believe in, is this thing called communities of support, right? There's one thing that I tell people immediately. For the longest time now, if someone begins to share and they share about a problem, I immediately tell them to seek therapy and treatment, because that's a non-negotiable, right? But along with it, I think what's also important is to have this group of people, steady group of people. It need not be a large group, right? But at least at the base minimum one, ideally more than one, a group of people whom you have access to pretty much all through the day, 24/7, right? Because how does a mental health experience, if there is one defining feature of a mental health experience is unpredictability. You don't know what is going to trigger you. It can happen at any time. And over time, as you get better, you have better control over the predictors and you're better able to manage it. But for a long time, there are a few defining features of a mental health experience, if you ask me. One is that it's relentless. The second is that it's unpredictable. The third is that the need for this 24/7 support, right? It's not that you're crippled and you cannot move through your daily life task. It's all the more harder. Everything is harder. Everything is 100 times harder than those as compared to someone who does not have it, right? Getting out of bed is difficult. Getting a bath is difficult. So what do you need then? So you put that in the context of you as a working person, right? Who has to do 10 hours of work a day, and also while navigating all these other extraordinary difficulties. So you are on treatment, you are taking your therapy, but you also need to bolster it with something else, right? Where when you have a crisis or an episode, a support system to reach out to. And that is your community of support, and that has got to be your group of people who can physically land up where you are, ideally, and who can very tangibly offer support, right? To make it more clear, one of the defining features of my mental health experience till about 2016, till about 2018, was freezing. I would freeze, right? And I'd get up from I would have these, I don't know when it would happen. And I don't know why it would happen. At that time, I didn't know why it would happen. But I'd sit in the seat that I'm sitting in now, and I would just freeze. And I'm aware of what's happening. I'm fully aware, I'm fully able to take in. It's not like I go into a trance or something, but I'm just freezing and I feel immobilized. So two examples that I really would like to, will throw light into how significant it is, right? One is with regard to my job, and in 2013 to 16, I was, heading research uptake for 2 India projects of a UK aid funded consortium, and it required a lot of travel. And you're traveling pretty much most of the time. It also required international travel, and travel can be, for those with anxiety, it can be you feel anxious before every travel, no matter how small or big it is, right? So I had to go to UK. It was the annual meet, and it was being held in UK at the time, and I had to go to UK. It was the day that I had to travel. My flight was in the afternoon, late afternoon that day. So I wake up, I come, and then I sit here, and then I freeze. So by then, since I had lived with, 2016, right? So it was already 5 to 6 years of living with and coping with anxiety and depression. I had also developed an ability to, therapy had also helped me to develop an ability to ask for help. I knew that I had to, one of the first things that I had to do when I started seeing trigger, or when I started seeing a symptom of something that can go wrong, I had to immediately seek help. So I called up this. I have this few friends, fairly like 5-6 large group of friends, different families, but they're all like that's what I count as my SOS circle, right? So I called one of them. There's this friend called Madhurima. We've gone to college together, and she married someone called Prashant. And I'm very close friends with both of them. And they're one of those rare people who have invested time, effort to understand, to read up, to educate themselves. So with them, I haven't felt the pressure that all of us experiencing it many times feel of having to educate others about what we are going through, right? With them, it has not been like that. They've made the effort to educate themselves and offer the kind of support I need. So I froze in the seat that day morning, and I called up. After a few minutes, I figured that this is not going to go down well, and I called up Madhurima, and they live 18 kilometers away in the other part of the city from where I live, and it was 9 o'clock on a weekday, very busy weekday. Their child was a toddler at that time, 2.5 years. And when I called them, they were out on the road. They were in the middle of things, and they were returning back to their home, and then they had to rush to work. And Maddie picked up the phone, and she was like, we made some, hello, how are you? Where are you kind of conversation. And we chatted, and she said, I've still, the amount of effort it takes to learn to ask for help, I still didn't ask her that, come, right? At the first call that I made, I just had a casual conversation, and she said she'll call me once she reaches home. And I was like, okay, let her reach home and call me back whenever that is. And we kept the phone. But in 5 minutes, 2-3 minutes, she called back, and she said, Prashant said, why don't you ask her? Maybe there is an emergency. We don't know. Why don't you ask her? And as it turned out, there was an emergency. I was freezing. I was going to, it was the beginning of what would have been a difficult time. I just said, can you come? What you thought is right. I'm having a difficult time. I can't move. Can you come? And they just kind of turned their car around, and they drove like 18 kilometers in peak Bangalore traffic, workday, weekday traffic, and they landed up. And my house help, Vijaya, was there at that time. She opened the door, and they walk in, and because I'm still frozen, I can't get up, and I have to travel to work for a very important meeting. And this is not like a trip to the next city, right? This is a trip to UK. Tickets are booked, money has been spent, there are presentations to be made, there is a lot of it is hinging on that, my travel. So they come in, I get up from my seat, I go, I hug Prashant, and I bawl. I bawl like for 20 minutes, like everyone I have in my life is dead for no reason, like loudly, right? He's standing there still, he's hugging me back, and he's holding me, waiting for me to finish. Maddie has Ira in her hand, and both of them are tearing up. And then I go and hug Maddie, and I bawl. And then that gets over. Then Maddie gets into action. She makes a list of things that I need to do so that I make it to airport in time, and everything that I need to do to be prepared to go. Now that's another thing, right? It's very difficult to plan when you're coping with, I found it extraordinarily difficult. Planning as a concept is really, really hard. And I've planned during my entire academic life, right, without any difficulty. So it's not like I've never been able to plan. But, once you have a mental health problem, it's very difficult to plan. And I found it So she puts down, she's the master of list, and she puts down the list of things that I have to do. They take their day off from work that day. They come with me. They take me out. We get everything that I need for the trip. They make sure that I'm packed and that I've gotten better. And they left just a few hours before I had to leave for the airport. That's what helped me make that work trip, right? So the point that I want to make is that you often don't have a choice to not be at work, right? As an adult, you have to do what all other the adults, you have to perform to the adult expectations, which is what? That you hold down a job, you go to work, you earn well, you pay your debts, you manage your life, you stand on your own feet, and doing all of these, being able to do all of these meant that I prioritized taking care of my mental health and did what I had to do to take care of it, right? Because otherwise all of this is not, it's going to be that much harder to do it. And I lucked out in the sense that I found support when I needed it. Even when I was in very, very difficult, I've been part of toxic workplace, right, later in my career, and it didn't make it. It was very hard. But the fact that I had these anchors in place, right? I mean, I was very committed to therapy. I was very committed to my treatment, and I was also I invested heavily in my communities of support, right? And I had it. Once I had it, I invested heavily in it, and and it's a metrics of these things that really helped, right? Stay at work in these past 13 years, and then slowly, take leaps when I felt confident about taking the extent of leap that I could make, right? So when it may not look like big leaps from outside, and it may not look like, even for me, right? Even if I was to my younger self and look, it would not be judged very kindly, but that's how it is. And I think that's also something that, especially for women, I think given that the demands on their time and the lack of structural support systems, right, even in very well functioning families, it's better, I felt, to accept and be authentic about how life is and how life plays out, than to have very romanticized notions of what situations will be and should be, and then be in constant angst that that's not what's happening, right? I mean, so you have to acknowledge that we do not live in an equal world. Even in the best of families, that's not going to happen, right? Especially in India. There are demands that's going to be made of as a woman that will disadvantage you very differently and much more severely than if you were a straight man, right? Heterosexual straight man. And that's the nature of it. And then you layer, okay, so you're a single woman. Then you are you're a woman with no privilege, right, of class or caste, or you're a woman without support of a family. You are divorced, right? You're a lesbian. You are there are and so what is your reality, right? If you take yourself, what is your reality? And it's a hard thing to do, but I have and map the difficulties that's with these layering, right? And you have to really slowly and deliberately work at creating support systems that can mitigate these barriers or can kind of cushion the effects of these disadvantages, and then figure out. It's very hard. And I don't want to today I've been well for 1.5 years, right? I mean, it's gone, and but I don't want to romanticize that. I don't want to say like it's I did it, so everybody can do it. Those kind of individualized success stories, right? I mean, it's very damaging, I feel. I mean, it's good to if there is one truth about a mental health experience, it is that your story is not going to look like mine, and our story is not going to look like our friend's story or another person's story. But if there are common things that will help, it definitely is that get onto treatment soon, figure out a way to get onto therapy soon, and build your communities of support, right? And another time I'll tell you, I mean, I've been so grateful and blessed to have have found this.
Yeah, and it's actually surprising that you say this, because it's interesting that you say this, because a lot of times people think that once you start therapy, the amount of support that you need to provide to someone that's going through therapy should reduce, right? But like you said, it's not necessary. In fact, that sort of support just sort of needs to be more constant, right? You don't just because they've begun therapy, that doesn't mean that the amount of support that you as a friend or a family member need to provide should reduce, right?
Yeah, no, so it's not this, so I think the mistake that people also make is seeing these as binary, standalone, disconnected anchors, right? And the point that I'm repeatedly making is they are not. It may seem like a singular problem that you have an anxiety disorder, but the solutions need to be so layered to help you get through a day and help you stay at work and to help you progress, make your exasperatingly slow and deliberate movement towards progress, right? And it's exasperating for someone experiencing it. It's exasperating even for those who provide support, right? I mean, so while I say these communities of support, it's, think about it, they're not people who are trained, no one's trained. Our informal network is not trained to provide it, they're not trained to give it, right? So and I'm assuming, I'm not making an assumption that everyone has access to it, right? But I do want to encourage people to open up and find, even if it is that one person or two people that you have, right? So when I come across people who are experiencing something, what worries me is not that. What worries me the most is when I figure out that they're lonely, that network is missing. Because then the immediate question is, how does one get through the day, right? Another time, I'll tell you, I have this lesbian friend, very dear friend called Dolly, right? And she, God, I'll never forget this. She was likewise one day evening, another freezing episode, and I figured out that I need to kind of reach out. And my other friends who, Prashant and Madhurima at that time I could not call them. This is my other friend called Shaila, who is relentlessly over the years, so many times dropped it. She's a single mother with 2 kids. She's come in the middle of the night so many times to come with me to take me to the doctor, because or just to spend time with me and to help me get through that phase of whatever I was feeling, right? And so Dolly, to come back to Dolly, I couldn't call all of them. So I called Dolly, and we made again some PC conversation, and then she asked me, but my friends are very tuned to it by then. So she was like, what happened, Priya? And I was like, do you think you can come? And I'm not feeling too well, and do you think you can? I don't think this is going to go down very well. The evening is not 6 o'clock. It's not starting very well. And it turned out that she was out on a first date with someone, right? First date with a girl. And what did she do? And I said, oh, okay, then it's okay. And I kept the phone. 20 minutes later, they both were at my door. And she came with her girlfriend, and then Dolly started hovering around me, and we all started talking, and not necessarily about what I'm experiencing or things like that, but generally chit chat and things like that. And the girl she was out with, she turns out she's a great singer, so she sang a song, and my utter and absolute surprise, and something that I truly told me how much the value of having that kind of support, and how much deeply loved I am. The girl left, her date left, and she chose to stay back with me to help me to make sure that I'll be all right through the night. I was okay in a few hours, but then she just wanted to make sure that she stayed back with me, and she helped me get through the night fine. That I sleep well and I'm fine, and that I felt like I had somebody to take care. So this is all outside of my workspace. You know what I'm saying? But this community of support outside of my workspace is what has really enabled me and has been critical in helping me stay at work and turn up at work when it was important, get through the day, cope with the demands of it, feel supported. And when that is lacking, I found that it becomes very hard. It should, right? So if you look at it within an organizational context, I think culture trumps everything, right? I mean, it is fundamental that you have to have a culture that's not toxic. So leadership training, even, you may not see the immediate connection in terms of mental health and leadership training, but I think it's fundamental to do it, right? How not to be a toxic leader is very, very important training. I mean, so the culture becomes very important, especially for leadership. The other thing that we see do is, there are these models of peer support networks, right? Organizations also provide access to therapists, and they pay for your access to a therapist. So that's one that you see. Then there is, I think, peer models, right, of creating. But that's not. I don't know if any of those peer model trainings are really, training people to, or if they can even do it, of training people to do what a therapist can do, or or provide the kind of intense outside of work support that your other networks can provide, right? I mean, it's hard. Think about it. You both are in the same workplace. You both are going through the grueling workday of 10 to 12 or sometimes 14-hour work days. And tiredness is real from work. I mean, modern work is demanding, and everyone works hard. And for an untrained caregiver to provide care to a mental health person, someone with mental health problem, is very, very, very hard. And I don't think there is enough caregiver support systems in India. You know, there is not even adequate mental health support system for those dealing with it. So no one's even thinking about caregiver support systems here. So when your culture of the firm, of the organization is not in place, then you're automatically making the assumption that your colleagues are going to do what the culture is not doing, right? That make the workplace more bearable and more accessible and more, that shouldn't be the case, right? Because you have to acknowledge that you are then, if the culture is not in place and you're making those, you're expecting somebody else to pull, other employees to pull the weight on behalf of the organization's culture, then you're going to drain them also out. It's if you think of it, it's a significant impact on your workforce, right, at a workforce level. So you also, I think, workplaces also need to understand the limits of the support they can provide, right? There is much that they can do. I mean, not that there is not, but like I said, micro planning becomes important. So if there are large teams, then maybe making them into smaller teams become important, and then looking at, okay, Priya has it, who's her closest, who can be her closest circle in the workspace, right? And how can you train them to provide the kind of support that Priya needs for her, for her mental health. So this rolling this out in scale is a challenge, right? I mean, there are limits to it. So what I'm really trying to say is that it's not limitless. The potential of a solution to address a problem is not limitless, right? There are limits to, for instance, my informal network of support can't do much about my workplace culture. It's not possible, right? I mean, I come out of the place, they provide a very crucial level of support. So for mental health, for people, especially for women struggling with mental health, I think maternity support programs become important, right? Those dealing with women in violent intimate partner relationships, then that manifests very differently. The fear is very different. One thing that I can think about is, the other day I was thinking, my single mother friends struggle so much about managing the school load of their kids. They work from morning till evening, and then they have to sit down to kind of, provide. So what can then within an organization a support look like, right? I mean, imagine that single mother coping with anxiety, or coping with some depression, or coping with some other mental health issues, right? What would the support for her look like? It will not be, I don't think it will be sufficient to provide her access to therapy. That's not going to be the only thing there, or it will be sufficient to, you will have to design a support matrix that looks very specific, caters to that person's need, right? And I think that's the struggle within large organizations, the struggle to individualize support, right? Not just individualized therapy, but individualized support, and seeing support as more than just, as a matrix of a lot of other things. And realize the limits of it. So I think that's important. Yeah.
You've actually worked in organizations that vary in size, right, and the strength of staff, for instance. So how does such intense support that you described with best practices, right, the sort of intensive community support, compassion, how does that play out in large-scale organizations, right? Because the minute we speak about scaling anything, or when we talk about scale, then it becomes about creating templates as well, homogenizing experiences, and then looking at providing solutions or providing a response that's sort of homogenized in a way. It doesn't really allow or hold space for the diversity that comes with lived experiences, right? So
yeah.
How did that play out in other organizations for you? Do you think it's even possible for such radical support or compassion?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting question, and it's I think an important question to consider, and it's something that I keep telling, that the complexity of providing mental health support in a workspace is also um, coming from the fact that your mental health experience is going to be very different from my mental health experience. So, in large spaces, when you have to roll out system wide support, that's kind of going against the kind of individualized support that that people need, right? So, Ganga is dealing with an anxiety, even if our conditions are the same. For instance, both of us may be dealing with an anxiety disorder, right? But how you manifest it, how you experience it, and what triggers you to have an episode, and what will enable you to cope with it well, is going to be really really different from how I experience it, how I manifest it, how what triggers me, and what are the enablers that are going to help me cope with it. So it's a challenging puzzle to solve, but I think it's a important thing to solve, right? And of late I've begun to think that there's this concept that was very widely used in the development sector, and in some of the sectors that I'm familiar with, like public health and livelihoods and all of that. It's the concept of microplan, right? And I often feel, so in therapy it's there, right? It's called individualized therapy. But I also feel when organizations truly care about the mental health of their well-being, providing mental health support to employees, that is what they really need to do. Can you make micro plans at the level of the individual who is experiencing it, map out what the triggers are, what the life context is, what can help, what's causing that anxiety, what is within your limits to address, what is not within your limits to address, these kind of questions, right? So it is a very hard thing to do in large systems, and today I don't have an answer of how it can be done, but I'm pretty sure that it's not going to be possible to provide the intensity of support that Best Practices Foundation and this organization of that size provided for me. Because even when I moved into a slightly mid-sized organizations, that became absent. Yeah. Right?
I have actually seen you while you were engaged with different organizations, right? And so I've actually noticed how you seem a little more at peace, and how it looks like your most recent work engagement, seems to be giving you some sort of stability in terms of mental health and well-being, right? So is there anything specific that you think they're doing right?
Yeah. No, it's been, so I started working with GV in 2018, and a couple of things, a few things. It's not just one thing, it's a few things. One is that I was brought in to build a team. So for me, and I've been building a team, communications team function within a large organization for about 3 years. So that was very exciting for me. And I had unconditional support to do it, right? So Libby was the executive director of Gram Vikas now. My professional relationship with him, and the experience of relating to a leader like that, I really value it. So there is no other word to describe it other than the fact that it's been an unconditional support. So there's the whole brief, but then I had a lot of agency to do what I wanted to do, build it at a pace that honored my not just mine but my small team members' emotional and physical well-being. Every time I had there was an issue where I said that I'm feeling anxious and I need to take time off. There is no question of what happened, when will you come back, or come back soon, like some of my other workplaces have told me. It's nothing like that. It's just, okay, take care, right? And take your time. So which is just, and there's no pressure to kind of feel better within a specific period of time or anything like that, right? So there's been unconditional support. There's been a lot of agency to do what I wanted to do, and there's the thrill of building something, right? And so for me, because work is so important to me, that did have a lot of impact on my mental health well-being. And of course, there are other things. I've also been able to build a team where how is your mental health question and like that is part of our official check-in process, right? It's not something that we do outside of official meetings. It's part of our official meetings. I can tell you that if you ask today, I'm pretty sure that comms team would be like one of the happiest teams in GB, right? And so it's given me a sense of success, and it's given me a sense of, I'm very proud of what the work that we've been able to do there. And so yeah, but I think the crux of it is it's just unconditional. The support was unconditional, whether it was in the way that I was building the team and doing the work and setting the agenda, or when I was struggling with my personal struggles. I lost a very dear friend, and there's much that I've gone through in my past 2.5 years when I was with GB, right? But very, very supportive during that time. And I've been able to create that culture. We've built that culture in our team also. So it's a subculture that is developing in that team. So yeah, I mean that's why you've seen the difference and you've seen the change. Yeah. So
Okay, so in a nutshell, if you were to sort of list out things that you feel help with your mental health
yeah.
while you were on your professional journey,
Yeah.
what would they
Yeah.
look like or be?
Yeah. Okay, so it's both internal and external facing. I would say, start your treatment as soon as possible. Stick with your treatment. Very important, right? Do not get off medications unless the doctor that you say ask you to get off to. 2, find your therapist and start on your therapy. Stick with your therapy. Don't drop out in the middle. 3, make deliberate choices of your workplaces to the extent that you can. I've not always been able to make it, but when I've been able to make it, it has worked in my favor. So in hindsight, I can say that it's a good thing to do. Make deliberate choices of your workplace. The other things that I had to do personally, which has helped me is, one of the things that one of my favorite professors, marketing professors in IRMA, taught me is the importance of noticing patterns, right? And I think I literally took it to my heart. So I've trained myself over the years, last 13 years, to notice patterns vis-a-vis what supports my well-being, mental health well-being, and what does not support, and what I need to do. And I've kind of been at it, and I respond very soon to alarms that go off when that pattern varies, right? So noticing the patterns, then learning to ask for help. It was not an easy thing for me to do. I had to learn it, and learning to ask for help shamelessly from wherever help would come and whoever would give me help, right? So the example of you turning up, right, a few years ago, we hardly knew each other very well then. We were in one workplace. We were nice to each other. We meant well for each other, and that's it, right? But that day when you called, I was going through one of those I couldn't get out of bed, and we were rushing towards building the Gram Vikas website, and I had a very important vendor meeting, website agency meeting, and I could not have been, and the deadline that we had set for ourselves for it was a launch of the website was not negotiable. It was part of a formal program. People were invited, and I had to make that meeting. You call just to check in, it was a very casual check-in, but I think because I had trained myself to ask for help over the years, I was able to open up and say that, I'm not doing very well, can you come, right? Without feeling, and that has been a very important lesson to learn. So treatment, therapy, making deliberate choices of your workplaces, learning to ask for help, observing patterns, and finally, having your communities of support, constantly seeking it, finding it, and bolstering it when you find it. And I think that's what has helped me. So yeah. Yes.